are so easily, as it were, led to consent to the inequalities of property and to rule by the stronger, which government brings into being. The social contract, as he presents it in the second discourse, is really a kind of swindle. The establishment of government is a kind of swindle that the rich and the powerful use to control the poor and the dispossessed. Again, rather than instituting justice, this compact merely legitimizes past usurpations. Government is a con game that the rich play upon the poor. Political power simply helps to legitimize economic inequalities. Governments, he tells us, may operate by consent, but the consent they are granted is based on falsehoods and lies. How else can one explain why the rich live lives that are so much freer, so much easier, so much more open to enjoyment than the poor? That is Rousseau's real critique and real question. And it is the establishment of government that is the last link in the chain of Rousseau's conjectural history. The last and most painful, in many ways, legitimation of the inequalities that have been created after our emergence from the natural condition. But what, again, is most painful to Rousseau is the emergence of a new kind of human being that this stage of civilization has been brought into, that this stage of civilization has brought into being. And Rousseau is the first, I think, to use that term so powerfully, which became used very much in the next 2 centuries, the bourgeois. The bourgeois is Rousseau's invention. And most striking about this human type for him is the necessity to appear to be one thing where actually being something else. Go back again to think of the way in which Plato or Socrates uses that distinction between seeming and being when he talks about the just man in Book 2 of the Republic, someone who seems to be and someone who is just. It is this tension between the two that is so central to Rousseau's account of what he calls the bourgeois. Being something and appearing to be something, he says, become two different things. And from this distinction there arose grand ostentation, deceptive cunning, and all the vices that follow in their wake. And in the penultimate paragraph of the second discourse, Rousseau describes the dilemma of the bourgeois in the following way. He says, the savage lives within himself. The man accustomed to the ways of society, the bourgeois, is always outside of himself and knows only how to live in the opinions of others. And it is, as it were, from their judgment alone that he draws the sentiment of his own existence. Think of that sentence. It comes from the next to the last paragraph of the book, that in society we only live through the opinions of others, through the gaze of others, through what others think of us. We are constantly, our own sentiment of existence, he says, our own sentiment of self and existence comes entirely from the judgment, as he puts it, of those around us. The bourgeois, in other words, is someone who lives in and through the opinions, the good opinions of others, who thinks only of himself when he is with other people, and only of other people when he is by himself. Such a person is duplicitous, hypocritical, and false. This is why this is the true you might say, discontent of civilization. This is what our perpetual restlessness and reflectiveness have made of us. Goaded on perpetually by amor propria, this is the particular misery that civilization has bequeathed us. So, the question at the end of the book is what to do about this. And here, in many ways, one has to say the second discourse falls short. The book, the essay, the book, ends on a note of utmost despair. It offers no positive answer to cure the problem of civilization but only hints at best at two possible solutions. One is suggested, you will recall, by the letter to the city of Geneva, which in a sense prefaces the book. Perhaps the closest approximation to the early state of primitive society lauded by Rousseau are the small, isolated rural republics, like Geneva in his own way, where a kind of simple patriotism and love of country have not been completely overwhelmed by the agitations of amour propre. Only, he says, in a well-tempered democracy like Geneva is it possible for citizens still to enjoy some of the equality of the natural man. Democracy for him, this kind of simple rural democracy like that of Geneva, is the social condition that most closely approximates the equality of the state of nature. And that, of course, is a theme that Rousseau will take up powerfully in his book, The Social Contract. But Rousseau offers another hint to the solution of the problem of civilization, what to do about it. How can we restore happiness and in the midst of society? The second discourse leaves us to believe that all society is a state of bondage and alienation from nature, from our true being. We have lost our true humanity that he describes in a state of nature, a state of pity, our capacities for pity and compassion and the like. And the answer to the problem of society is, in many ways, to return to the root of society. And this root of society is not just the need for self-preservation, but a kind of primordial, as he calls it in that passage I read a minute ago, sentiment of existence, the sentiment of our own existence. By giving oneself over to this feeling of existence without a thought for the future, without care or fear, the individual somehow psychologically returns to the natural state. Only very few people, Rousseau writes, he being one of them, of course, only a very few people are capable of finding their way back to nature. The type of human being who can find their way back to the sort of pure sentiment of existence is not going to be a philosopher, is not going to be a person of high-order reflection like Socrates, but will more likely be an artist or a poet. He is one of those rare aristocrats of nature, you might say. His claim to superiority is not based on a higher understanding, but a superior sensitivity, less on wisdom than on compassion. Rousseau believed himself to be one of these people. Maybe you also are one of them, yes? But it requires you in some way to distance yourself severely and psychologically from all of the possibilities of society, to return inward. And it was that inward journey that Rousseau took and that he writes about so powerfully in his Confessions and his final book, The Reveries, where you find the Rousseau founder of the romantic disposition that you get again in writers in America like Thoreau and others who look inward and return to nature in some way, their natural self, as opposed to society. But the second discourse leaves us, to be sure, with a paradox. The progress of civilization is responsible for all of our miseries. Yes, it is society's fault. It's not your fault, it's society's, he wants to tell us. And yet, he also leaves us with no real apparent way out. He denies that we can, as a practical solution, return to simpler, more natural forms of political association. But how then do we resolve the problem of that he leaves us with? And his answer to it, his political answer to it, his most famous political answer to it, is contained in his book, yes, called The Social Contract. du Contrat Social, published in 1762, 7 years after the Second Discourse. Here he attempts to give one such answer, and I mention one such answer because it is not his only or final answer, but one such answer to the problems of inequality and the injuries of amour propre. Social contract begins with one of the most famous sentences in all of the history of political philosophy. Man is born free and is everywhere in chains. Always begin your essays with a good, strong sentence like that. Rousseau knew this. He knew something about how to write. The phrase seems to be perfectly in keeping with the Second Discourse. In the state of nature, we are born free, equal, and independent. Only in society do we become weak, dependent, and enslaved. It is what follows after that sentence, in a way, that is the shocker. How did this change take place? Rousseau asks. I do not know. What can render it legitimate? I believe I can answer this question. What can render it legitimate? And by the it, I take it he means the chains, as in the state man is born free and is everywhere in chains. In the Second Discourse, he had attempted to completely delegitimize the bonds of society, saying how the social contract and the creation of government was nothing but in many ways a sophisticated swindle. Now, in the social contract, he asks the question, what can give these chains or bonds moral legitimacy? He says, I believe I can answer that. Has Rousseau simply undergone a massive change of heart?